Was the Kherson offensive a diversion which allowed a real offensive to take place in Kharkiv? And this is the main narrative these days. But personally, I don't buy it. The media talked about a Ukrainian operation against Kherson for a month, non-stop. This offensive was important. Think about it, the capture of Kherson would have been a disaster for Russia. Apart from the loss of prestige, it would have been a political nightmare, since Kherson city was the first major Ukrainian city that Russia has secured, and this region was preparing a referendum to join Russia. If half of Kherson is gone and all the major cities are under Ukraine control, there is no referendum. And militarily speaking, if the Russians lose Kherson, they also lose their last remaining bridgehead over the Dnieper. And by reaching the Dnieper, it also opens the door for a possible Ukrainian offensive towards Crimea. Why would you not want this offensive to be successful? What you have to understand is that the Ukrainian/NATO plan was much more sophisticated, and this is what you'll discover in this video. Hi and welcome to History Legends. Here are the latest news about the Russo-Ukrainian war. Here we cut the BS and talk about what the media doesn't tell you. As always, information changes by the hour, so if you have any new info, just comment it below. If you're new to this channel, make sure to check out my Ukraine playlist so you don't miss anything I've said in the past. And as you know, like with many other commentators, some of my videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to subscribe to my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Huge thanks to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. Un, dos, tres! For many months, Ukraine threw hundreds of thousands of conscripts to the front to stall the Russians. Meanwhile, they managed to train an elite task force meant for offensive duty. Many of them trained in Britain. And like that, the Ukrainian armed forces also solved the problem regarding the coordination of their offensives. Now, they were able to coordinate multiple battalions, if not multiple brigades. In this ideal scenario, Ukraine's goal was to terminate the war before winter, and before Russia annexes the occupied territories through gunpoint referendums. To achieve that, the Ukrainian armed forces had to attack before fall, before the muddy, rainy season, so Ukrainian vehicles would not get bogged down like the Wehrmacht did in 1941. And that way Russia would also not be able to counterattack before the soil freezes in winter. So late summer was the perfect time. Now launching a diversion and then the real strike is very Soviet, a very primitive way to wage war. In my opinion, and this is speculative, NATO thought of something much more sophisticated, an incremental attack in several phases. Phase 1 was the attack on Kherson. Its objective was that in 4 or 5 days to break through in multiple places and rush to secure the crossings over the Dnieper at Kherson and Nova Karovka, with HIMARS having destroyed most remaining pontoons, and with no other way to retreat. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Russia's elite airborne units would have been trapped and encircled, on their way to Ukrainian prison camps. With Russian forces in southern Ukraine in total disarray, Phase 2 would have started, that is, the attack on Balakleya. Once again, in 4 or 5 days, the goal was to reach the Oskol Reservoir, capture Kupiansk and cut the Russian supply line towards Izium, then push south to encircle thousands of Russian troops in the Izium salient. At this point, within only a couple days, Russia would have suffered at least 40,000 casualties, the majority as POWs. Within a week or two, Russia would have lost control over most of Kherson and Kharkiv Oblast. This is when Ukraine would have launched Phase 3, an attack on Zaporozhye Oblast against Melitopol. For the success of this offensive, speed is the essence. The elite Ukrainian mechanized and airborne units would have been quickly refitted and launched right into the battle. We repeat the recipe, a 5-day operation and breakthrough towards Melitopol, coupled with a river crossing over the Dnieper, would have effectively wiped out the remaining Russian forces in Kherson and brought the fight directly to Crimea. At this point, within 2 weeks, Russia would have almost been pushed to pre-war borders, with thousands of its best soldiers in captivity, and Kherson, Zaporozhye and Kharkiv Oblast back in Ukrainian hands. Now you might ask, why is this guy with a weird accent obsessed with 5-day operations? Because that's the specialty on the NATO menu. Ground operations during Operation Desert Storm lasted from the 24th to the 28th of February 1991. 5 days. The Croatian Operation Summer from the 25th to the 29th of July 1995. 5 days. Now, if you rewatch some of my old videos, I said that Ukraine should do exactly like the Croatians did with Operations Oluya, or Operation Storm in English, where they attacked from the 4th to the 7th of August 1995, 4 days. And then the Ukrainians in Kharkiv managed a huge breakthrough between the 7th and the 11th of September. In every case, we're talking about a modern blitzkrieg of around 5 days. But overall, there are many similarities with what the Ukrainians did in 1995 and the Ukrainians in 2022. We already talked about the duration of the operations, but it's also interesting to note that the Croatians launched Phase 1, Operation Summer, with a strike force of 8,500 troops to shape the battlefield between July 25th to the 29th. And not even 1 week later, they launched Phase 2 on the 4th of August, which was the main offensive, Operation Oluya, that involved 130,000 Croatian soldiers that swarmed Serbian positions with a numerical advantage of 4-1. And more importantly, of course, in both cases, NATO was behind it. They trained local combatants and officers and basically planned the entire thing. So bravo NATO for being able to replicate such operations in different environments. But one thing that helped is that they always faced Soviet-inspired armies, which probably suffered from the same weaknesses. Lastly, in Operation Storm, Croatia regained more than 10,000 square kilometers, whereas in Kharkiv, Ukraine gained 9,000 square kilometers, perhaps even more by now. Perhaps it's just me, let me know in the comment section, but I find there's a lot of similarities between the way these operations were thought. I thought it was also interesting to point out that Croatia suffered relatively low losses during this double blitzkrieg. Meanwhile, Serbia lost hundreds of KA and over 4,000 prisoners. The Serbian army was on its knees and the country eventually stopped fighting in November 1995. So it's very possible that with similar coordinated strikes, the West expected Russia to stop fighting by November 2022. So let's analyze the result of every phase. Phase 1, results. Here you can see the Kherson front line on August 28th and now on September 29th. After a month since the start of the attack in the Kherson region, the Ukrainian offensive lost steam and Russians managed to stabilize the front. Even the huge Ukraine bridgehead between Bilohirka and Blahodativka was significantly reduced. So unlike what many haters think, my previous video is still valid, a bridge too far. In Kherson, Ukraine is said to have lost 12,000 casualties, 4,000 KA, and 8,000 wounded in the active phase of the offensive from the 29th of August to September 8th, plus an unknown amount of casualties since then. Now if you take a look at the graph behind me, you can see that the bloodiest day of the Ukraine offensive was day 2, August 30th, with reportedly 1,200 KIA. These figures are from the Russian Ministry of Defense, and again, it's totally fine if you don't believe them. But let's take a look at the Washington Post. They interviewed wounded Ukrainian soldiers from the attack on Kherson, and here's what they had to say. Ihor, a 30-year-old platoon commander, we lost 5 people for every one they did. And he said that 16 of the 32 men under his command were injured and 1 was killed. Alexander said, they were just hitting us all the time. If we fire 3 mortars, they fire 20 in return. Next up is Dennis. No, not the famous YouTuber. Another Dennis. He said that almost every member of his 120-person unit was injured, though only 2 were killed. A 25-year-old soldier being treated for shrapnel wounds said that within his unit of 100 soldiers, 7 were killed and 20 injured, or 27%. But then the media in the West was kind of salty and coping about the results. The disappointing results of the Kherson offensive. They said things like, it won't be quick, it's hard, slow fought, meter by meter, position by position. But reality is, they wanted a quick breakthrough. So we can end by saying that Phase 1 was not as conclusive as Ukraine had expected. But they did not stop there. Phase 2, results. What I call Phase 2 brought the most success to Ukraine. Here was the Kharkiv front line on September 6th, on September 12th, and now the front line today. The Russian front has entirely collapsed. I made an entire analysis about it. You can check it out. The link is in the description. Now, some claim that Russia was already withdrawing its troops from Kharkiv before the Ukrainian offensive and rotated better quality Russian units with second-rate LDPR militiamen and National Guard units. And we don't know how many men Russia has actually lost during this battle. From all the reports, the Russians mostly retreated and fought rearguard actions, probably to allow their comrades to withdraw. Now, even if all this was true, it doesn't mean it was planned. It could have been the result of this action. Objectively, Ukraine destroyed or captured lots of enemy vehicles, liberated a huge part of its territory, basically all of Kharkiv Oblast from Russian occupation. They showed all their Western partners that yes, they can win the war. More importantly, look at this Ukrainian map. With the latest counteroffensive, Ukrainians eliminated the Russian bridgehead at Izium, which was directly threatening northern Donetsk and the strategic urban areas of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. I said it many times and the Ukrainian general staff thought the same thing. It's just logical that from Izium the Russians could encircle this entire region and all the Ukrainian troops in it. Ukraine had to eliminate this constant threat on their flank to properly defend Donbass. Now, if Russia wants to go back on the offensive, they have no other choice but to launch frontal attacks on fortified positions. So we can conclude by saying that Phase 2 was extremely successful. Phase 3 results. Generally speaking, Phase 3 is harder to analyze, so bear with me. What I think happened is that Ukrainians did in fact attempt to shape the battlefield in Zaporozhye Oblast by probing Russian defenses with strengthened recon missions. But similarly to Kherson, they probably determined that enemy defenses were too strong and that attacking in open field would not be the best idea against Russian artillery. Any concentration of Ukrainian forces in that area would also be immediately spotted by the Russians. Put simply, Ukraine had to change its plans. And since the Russian front in Kharkiv Oblast collapsed so fast, the Ukrainian army did the logical thing and kept pressing its advantage. During their withdrawal, the Russians hoped that the Oskol River would stop the Ukrainians. But it didn't. It actually did, but not for a long time. Defending the Oskol River and reservoir was a good idea from Russia because the Oskol Reservoir is too wide for river crossings. But by the end of September, Ukrainians simply bypassed and attacked north and south of it. In the north, they captured the strategic city of Kupiansk and established an important bridgehead beyond the river. And they managed to do the same thing further north. This means that they can launch an offensive from this area at any moment. Yet it's south of the Oskol Reservoir that Ukraine managed yet another success. Ukrainians pushed in the center from Savyansk and Raihorodok to fix enemy troops at Lyman. And once again, we see a common feature of Ukrainian offensive, the use of forested areas for camouflage. And it's the Ukraine grouping located between Oskil and Studenok that broke through at Lozove. Once again, the Russian front line completely collapsed and Ukrainians reached the Luhansk border. And in the end, the Russian grouping is in an operational encirclement, with the town of Zarishne being the only line of communications left with the Russian garrison at Lyman. Still, unless Russia benefits from a miracle, pouring rain for days, they will have to abandon this position as well and pull back entirely to the Luhansk border. At this point, the Russians cannot effectively defend the Oskol River and are probably now just holding to gain some time and hold the Ukrainians long enough for the referendums to go through. Conclusion: did Ukraine achieve a victory with its counteroffensives? Militarily speaking, yes. It's undeniable, even if it wasn't as spectacular as they probably have planned. Thing is, the Russian army was not fully destroyed. Most of the time, they retreated. Perhaps we're close to a 1812 or 1941 situation. As you know, historically speaking, the Russian bear should be feared when it's backed up against the wall. Reinforcements are also on their way. And I'm gonna make a self-standing video on the Russian mobilization and what it would mean for the war in Ukraine. Politically, it also became clear that for Russia, Kharkiv Oblast was much less important than Kherson, the less valuable of the occupied territories. They did not hesitate to abandon it. But this Ukraine military success and the repression of pro-Russian populations in Kharkiv also allowed Moscow to immediately launch the referendums for annexation towards Russia of Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And I think nobody was shocked that they voted overwhelmingly to join Russia. Some claim the results are fake. Maybe there is a problem with percentages, but after seeing what happened to pro-Russian populations in Kharkiv, I'm pretty sure all pro-Russian Ukrainians are scared as shit right now. and they prefer to be part of Russia because there's no going back to Ukraine. Ukrainians simply don't consider them as fellow Ukrainians anymore. And in the West, every country said they're not going to recognize the results of these referendums, but it doesn't matter. What matters is how Russians view it. If these territories officially integrate Russia, for Russians, this will be homeland and not lands of Ukraine that can easily be abandoned. So it will be very interesting. That would mean that the Ukrainian army will be directly at the Russian border. I will discuss all this in another video. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And as always, if you want to keep the show running, make sure to support me on PayPal and Patreon.